Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Hello, Gary.
John, how are you?
Doing well. You know, looking forward to the show. I think I'm going to learn as much as everybody else is.
Yeah, it's going to be packed. We've got great people who are going to bring information that you and our heads may explode before the show's over.
Well, let's bring them in then. We've got Devin Lindsay from S&P Global Mobility, Mike Barrott from Plante Moran, and Mike Martinez from Automotive News. Great having all you guys here.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
All right. So Mike, I want to start with you because we got you on. You cover Ford, and there was big news this week that Ford made, and this will segue into the rest of the show. So tell us what the Ford Motor Company did in Marshall, Michigan earlier this week.
Well, they picked a site for a new battery plant, a massive battery plant. It's going to create 2,500 jobs. They're spending $3.5 billion on this thing. It's going to be set up a bit uniquely. It's going to be a wholly owned Ford subsidiary, but they're working with CATL. It'll be their technology in these batteries. Essentially, it's going to give them the opportunity to produce different type of battery chemistry, LFP batteries, for use in Mustang Mach-E's and F-150 Lightnings in the future. It's set to open in 2026, so a few years out. But they're arguing it's going to help bring costs down. These batteries are cheaper to build. They don't use as much of the rare materials like nickel and cobalt that the other batteries they use require, and that it will help certain owners of certain EVs in certain use cases. They claim that the LFPs are better than NCM, depending on what you need that EV for. So pretty big news for that company trying to continue its ramp of EVs here.
So, Mike, is it really going to happen? I mean, as you know, this week, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida came out and he's alarmed about it, he says. He's demanding that the Biden administration review this because we might become too dependent on the Chinese Communist Party. And now we just learned today in China, the Communist Party is saying, hey, wait a minute, we're going to review this whole thing. And we want to make sure that CATL is not giving Ford its best technology. So what do you think is going to happen? And your guess is as good as anyone, so you may as well guess.
Well, I'd say that if people are just now starting to get worried that we're too dependent on China, especially in the EV battery space, that ship has long sailed. We are dependent on them for now. The goal, at least from Ford's perspective, is to wean themselves off of a dependence on China through this partnership. I don't know if this is just political posturing or if anything will actually come of this. Ford seems ready and raring to go to break ground out in Marshall and get this thing going. Their argument is that it's going to be a Ford building with Ford employees. Not a single cent of tax dollars is going to CATL here. It's all going to Ford. They're just using their technology to get these.
So to be clear, so Ford is basically buying the machinery and the equipment from CATL, and they're going to put it in this building, and they're going to build batteries with it.
That's my understanding. Yeah, and even
CATL people will come over to set it all up and run it
to sort of help them out and talk them through the launch and the ramp there. And even if you look on the union side, Ray Curry, president of the UAW, said it's his understanding that this plant should be unionized fairly easily through a card check. They don't have to go through the process of a whole union vote like they have to do with the JVs, like with Ford down in Louisville City in Tennessee, like GM is doing at some of its battery JVs. So their hope is you should be union jobs as well.
Hey, Devin, let's get your any thoughts on that? Do you think Marco Rubio or the Chinese Communist Party are going to torpedo this deal?
Well, that's an interesting way to put it with everything going on with the balloons over the United States skies and everything. But, this is what makes so much of this so difficult because so much is just involved with the politics. And definitely there's going to probably be some posturing heading there because certainly the Biden administration can claim this as the first initial victory that they've had and really being involved in making sure this investment takes place in the U.S. So I think right now, once the handshaking gets going on And once everyone figures out what's in it for them, then I think everyone will calm down. This may not be the last deal like this that we actually see taking place for a state to benefit and giving them more jobs.
Yeah. And Mark Barrett, what do you think?
Interesting that, when you think about, we'll talk about the IRA later, but, the foreign entities of concern, China being, predominant amongst them, the fact that there is this construct that Ford have put together, and Mike probably knows a lot more about that than I do, but that construct that's been put together to sort of defend against that concern from the Biden administration, that's interesting. We've seen not just this example, but there are other examples of battery manufacturers who have Chinese intellectual property coming into the US, applying for government loans, ATVM loans, etc. And I think the way Ford have done this is really interesting, very interesting.
My guess is it'll happen. Ford doesn't operate in a vacuum. They're so savvy when it comes to the politics of Washington.
Mhm.
Undoubtedly, they sounded out the administration saying, hey, what if we go with CATL? We still going to get the money? And they wouldn't have gone through with this whole deal, I think, unless they had strong signals that it was all going to be okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and to that point, we had a chance to talk with Bill Ford a little bit at that battery plant announcement earlier this week, and he did say they have been in pretty constant communication with the administration, talking through a lot of this. Some of the other executives said, this is the reason they set the plan up this way, is to guard against a lot of what the concerns were. So that's their argument. We'll see if it pans out.
Mike, I want to ask
maybe just one thought on this, Mark. I wanted to follow up. You mentioned other battery companies with Chinese intellectual property. There's Envision AESC, which is ostensibly a Japanese company headquartered in Japan, but it's owned by the Chinese. And, Mercedes is dealing with them. BMW is dealing with them. Nissan looks like it's going to deal with them because this actually comes out of the old Nissan battery plants. But no one has brought this up yet. That, to your point, CATL is not the only Chinese entity playing around in American battery building.
They are not, but both in the U.S. and then when you think about USMCA, when you think about Mexico and Canada as well, and particularly Mexico, you're starting to see a significant interest from the Chinese entities thinking about, I'm not going to say backdooring into Mexico, but thinking about how they evolve into USMCA region and take advantage of that. So, and then we know of a couple of specific examples actually out west where battery manufacturers that have, again, as I said, Chinese IP that are launching, and the DOE from their perspective are sort of saying, hang on a minute, because this is not the direction that we want to go, or the IRA goes, or the administration is going. So, yeah, I guess watch this space a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, before we get away from Ford entirely, what is the sense from the people that you talk to there of their position in the EV world right now vis-a-vis their competitors?
They like where they're at. They feel they're ahead of their own internal schedules. If you look at sales, they're number 2 as a company to Tesla, largely because of the conversation we're going to get into later, the IRA. Hyundai Motor Group didn't have access to the tax credits, or doesn't have access to some of the tax credits that sort of helped boost Ford in the back half of last year even. They're happy with where they're at from a demand side. Obviously, in terms of execution, that's a whole nother story. Their vehicles are not profitable right now. That's an issue if they're not making money on them. And obviously, you have the news of the week, I think, with F-150 Lightning production being down for a couple of weeks over that battery fire, trying to figure out the cause of that issue and how to move forward there. So depends on what side you're looking at it from, but in terms of the demand, in terms of sales, they are, Jim Farley wanted to be number 2 in the US at the end of this year. They got there in 2022 and they got there in 2021 actually as well, although that was kind of an asterisk because that was the year, GM would have beat them if not for the Bolt battery fire, recall, and stop sale. So Ford's been number 2 the past 2 years. That's ahead of schedule.
So what do you think is going on with that battery? I mean, Ford says they've identified the root cause of the problem, but as you just said, that plant's going to be closed for like 3 weeks. You know, it seems to me there's some disconnect there. I mean, if you found the root cause of the problem, why does it take you 3 weeks to crank production back up?
Yeah, I think that there's a high level of concern there. Obviously, they're saying there's no risk at this point to all the Lightnings in customer hands or at dealerships right now, although they stopped all the ones that are in transit. But you're right. Let's say they are able to fix that problem just like that and get this plant up and running at the end of next week. That's still, 3 weeks, at least a couple thousand units, 3, 4, 5,000 units if we're estimating here. That's real money. That's going to be even more of a delay for all these people that are waiting a very long time for this vehicle. So it's not good for their bottom line. It's not good for perception as well, right? They're trying to establish themselves as the clear number 2 and eventually take on Tesla in the US. If this snowballs into anything more serious, that's going to set back their ambitions a bit, I think.
So Mark or Devin, does this situation, as well as the battery fire that Mike mentioned that the Bolt had, does this indicate that maybe the domestic OEMs, which are really good at internal combustion engines, may not be so good yet in terms of EVs at the rate they're pushing forward?
Devin, I'll let you go.
Sure, thank you. Well, certainly, I think that's definitely a possibility. There's going to be growing pains involved with all of this, and I think we've seen it with every single OEM that has launched a product. And that may be another reason why Ford is taking their time. They may say that they know where the problem is at, but it probably is still best to make sure, it's kind of like before you send a child back to school, you want to make sure that they're well before, anything else happens again. So let's just keep them home a little bit longer. And that probably is what Ford is doing here, because no one can really handle continuous bad publicity. If one fire happens, then another one happens, and then don't let it, be another vehicle involved. And then once you start going down that road and your customers start hearing that all the time, and that becomes the main headline, then it's going to take a really long time to get back to that. So it's probably best to go through it now with these growing pains. And in the meantime, they can still invest and earn money from their ICEs to kind of get them through this tough time. And, that's another conversation for another show, I'm sure. But they can still go ahead and make some profits off the ICEs until that maturity takes place. They don't have to worry about it nearly as much.
Yeah, Gary, I tend to agree with Devin there. I think this is I remember when Lordstown had a thermal runaway event, right, aka fire. That was a very long investigation into the root cause, and it turned out it was actually a messed up manufacturing process on one of the tabs on the end of a module. It's not, and it wasn't found within any other vehicle. It was an anomaly. And so, to Devin's point, maybe that's what we're finding out here, is that there will be these growing pains. There will be manufacturing anomalies that are not systemic, but my word, do they ever raise to the public, right?
They got to poke a yoke it. You got to make it foolproof, mistake proof.
Yep. Not that every ICE has ever been mistake-proof.
Exactly.
Right?
No, I remember years ago, Ford had hired a guy on the assembly line for Mustang wiring. There's red wires and white wires and black wires and gray wire. He was colorblind.
Wow.
They found that problem pretty quickly. So let's talk IRA. Devin, let me throw it in your lap. Is this going to be the legislation that is really going to put the U.S. on the map from an EV manufacturing standpoint?
Well, I think it needed to be done. That's certainly the goal. That's certainly the ambition of the legislation. And I think for really, we always talked about infrastructure for over a decade when EVs were coming out. And every president has always talked about the need for infrastructure in one way, shape, or form, whether we're talking about roads, buildings, et cetera. But something needed to be done now with building up this supply chain for all of these electric vehicles that the whole world has allegedly been waiting for so many years. So I think on one end, it certainly is anticipated anticipated it could be that way. But still, in the end, customers are going to get the final word. And the opportunity now for them to go ahead and include more tax credits in there, even down to used vehicles as well, used battery electric vehicles. That's certainly the intent. But still, whether customers are going to be ready to jump out of their ICEs, this is going to go a long way into help encouraging them to do so. And certainly in concert with California's Advanced Clean Cars, or as we call it, the ZEV mandate, in concert with that as well. I think both of them working together can really aid and make that, certainly a possibility for the United States to kind of have this landmark legislation. Now, again, whether customers choose it or not is one thing, and also about other regions as well, if they end up retaliating with their own, which could be a nightmare for manufacturers.
So, Devin, you seem rather realistic about this. Let's go into this for a moment.
Okay.
So, while we're hearing General Motors and Ford and to a little smaller degree Stellantis say, "Oh, this is where we're going. This is our future," you seem to be, you're involved in looking at powertrains across the board. Are you seeing continued strength for the next several years, at least in ICEs, despite the IRA?
Well, I think we have to be realistic about it, because if we go throughout history, we've always seen kind of going forward and coming back, whether we're talking about the 70s with fuel crisis, and we go to the 80s where we had downsize and turbo, and then we ended up going back to high horsepower and V8s. So just from a realistic standpoint, I think this is what makes IRA so beneficial, because it became something that the United States actually put a stake in the ground and said that they were going to do. And if we go back, some years ago, that's something that all of the other regions had done, but the United States had not done the same thing. So now they have to really convince the public that they're going to be serious and not turn back. California and its related states, as they call them, the Section 170 states, had done so. But this is the first time we're really seeing this at the federal level. So I think that's why there's so much potential and so much upside. And it certainly makes GM look smart with the commitment that they said they were going to make toward complete battery electric vehicles by 2035. And now all the other manufacturers can say, yes, this is why we made that commitment. But now, again, we're still at this early stage. And so it finally gives teeth to some of the words that were coming out of the mouth of so many of the manufacturers for so long. But that still does not mean that the IC is going to be completely extinct within the next 10 years.
So, Mark, what do you think? IRA, that's going to do it for the U.S., or is it going to end up being competitive with China?
Well, I think it's a major step forward. I really, I think what we're going to see is some of the potential, I'm not sure whether they're unintended consequences, but I was talking earlier this week around the dynamic pricing, right, from a Tesla or a Ford, as we've seen too, and others, but nothing coming from a Renault or a Volvo. I saw BMW sticking with their pricing because, quotes, they think they've hit the pricing right. Well, the reality is they don't have the flexibility that domestic manufacturers have coming up to play around with that. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing to be playing around with dynamic pricing now, where we're still trying to get consumers on board with EVs, have some confidence in what they're buying? I don't know that this is the time to be playing around with that dynamic pricing. And when the IRA was first announced, we had a lot of discussion internally around, is this money, whether it be obviously the credits to the consumer is not in doubt, but the production tax credits, the sort of $45 a kilowatt hour for battery manufacturing, is that going to stay with the OEM or the Ultium or the Ford, as Mike has been describing, with the wholly owned subsidiary, or is it going to be passed to the consumer? And we always wondered whether that would be where that would sit. And I think we're seeing that pendulum will swing back and forth, because now they've got this money to play with. If you think about, a 100 kilowatt battery pack, you've got $4,500 to play with if you want to, from a pricing perspective, that you can pass on if you feel you should. And so I think that's going to play out over the next few years with domestic producers being able to play with that, and folks who are on Asian or European manufacturers who are outside of the US at a disadvantage.
So go,
So
go into that a bit
explain,
more.
but let's wait. But explain what you mean about this $45. I mean, for
Yeah,
people who
that
are
was
not
my
in the
question
weeds in
too.
this.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like explain how this happens.
So as part of the IRA, there is a 35 kilowatt per hour for available to you, plus another $10 per kilowatt hour available to you if you're making and manufacturing batteries in the US.
So it's
And so-
$35 for the cell and $10 for the pack.
Right. So a total of 45 kilowatts per hour. So 45 kilowatts per hour. So when I calculate that to $4,500, I'm assuming a 100 kilowatt pack, right? Which is an average. The lyric is average is a 100 kilowatt per hour battery pack. So you've now so that's a production tax credit that is available to manufacturers in the US. That is not available to anybody that's importing batteries from Southeast Asia or from China or wherever. That now that a GM with a Ford, a Stellantis, if they're here, anybody that's producing a battery cell and module and pack here has available to them, which I think is really an interesting part of the future dynamic of an OEM being able to price that.
So the factory that Ford is building in Marshall, Michigan. So they build this big factory, and let's say that coming off the line are 100 kilowatt hour packs, and every time one of those things comes off the line, Ford gets $4,500 from the government.
Yep,
and Ford does believe it will
right.
qualify for the full $45.
That's a lot of money. That's incredible.
Ultium's the same.
So what? I mean, look, this can't go on forever, right? I mean, Uncle Sam's not just going to be shoveling out money. When do we run out of this money?
10 years. The legislation is 10 years.
Whew. Wow.
Yep.
So isn't this basically an incentive to build battery plants?
Absolutely. I mean, if you looked at from the announcement of the IRA to, let's say, today, when you saw the announcements, continued announcements that are going forward. Even folks like Mazda and Honda, and folks that you would think would not traditionally have a battery joint venture are having a battery joint venture. Now, the one piece which is interesting, and we still have to get confirmation of this, and I think, John, you alluded to this, that the final Treasury regulations will be announced sometime early March. One of the things we're hearing is that there's potentially going to be a $4.5 billion cap on the production tax credits, and if that's the case, then that will influence a little bit. We're also seeing, not to put two and two together to make five, but the fourth Ultium plant that was announced is not going to be with LG. It's going to be with, quotes, another provider. Well, that may start another $4.5 billion clock running for GM, for example, because it's not with the same partner and manufacturer. So watch this space, because we don't exactly know how that will play out. But there's some implications for how the final regulations are written and what that means for some of the partnerships that we're seeing today.
So Mike, do you get the sense that when you talk to the execs at Ford that they're very cognizant of the fact that when they're making EcoBoost engines, they're not getting $4,500 every time they build one, and that if they build these battery plants, they're going to be making money on the front end and on the back end?
100%. I mean, this IRA, all the provisions here, 100% influenced where they put this plant. Right? They said they looked at a number of sites outside of North America, but they picked Michigan. Obviously, Virginia was in the running. There was that whole storyline about how Governor Youngkin took them out of the running because of his concerns over China. But I think this is going to spur companies like Ford to do what Ford did and to invest in the U.S. here. They are cognizant of the fact they're getting this money. I don't want to speculate in terms of what these guys have talked about in terms of passing it on to the consumer or not. But, like I said, I will point out these are very thin margins, negative margins actually, on these vehicles that they're producing. So you wonder how, if they may want to keep that money, at least in the next few years. Maybe once they do start making money off the Lightnings and Mach-E's and whatever else is next, maybe they rethink that strategy.
John, if you're saying something, I don't think we can hear you.
Yep.
All right, I'll ask a question while he's busy getting his microphone to work. Okay, so all of this money we're talking about, this is separate from the $7,500 that consumers conceivably can get, right?
Correct.
Anybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
No. Absolutely. It's a separate piece of. It's a separate pot. Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Okay. So I was just going to jump in. Our colleague Joe White at Reuters has a real good theory, I think, as to why Youngkin did what he did. And Joe's theory is that Youngkin knew Virginia was not going to get the site. And in fact, Jim Farley told the mayor of Marshall, Michigan, "You are our hands down choice." So Joe's theory is Youngkin realized he was not going to get it and decided to make political hay with it. As long as he's not getting it, why not get some plus out of it and declare he's not going to bow down to the Chi-Coms?
You know what? I'd say that's probably a very smart theory, especially because when you think of locally here, there's been a lot of concern, a lot of hand-wringing over the fact that Ford chose Tennessee and Kentucky for the Blue Oval City project. And there was some reporting afterwards that Michigan just was not prepared to offer facilities, a site that big to meet Ford's needs. So some changes were made in terms of what happens out in Lansing and the incentives offered to try to spur more investment and make sure that the state of Michigan did not lose out on the next possible investment. And we've seen subsequently GM make some announcements here in the state and Ford. So I think the Blue Oval City snub of Michigan may have played into this as well, right? And that would make total sense for Governor Youngkin to sort of take that stance there.
So one of the things we haven't talked about vis-a-vis the IRA is the fact that the minerals that go into these batteries, there's also money there. Is that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of the. That's actually part of the $7,500 of consumer incentives. Where we have to have minerals either processed, extracted, or processed. So that is an interesting switch there, and much of the supply chain that's being developed around the battery value chain in the U.S. is around processing, right? So we're still going to see raw materials come in from overseas, but provided they're processed in domestically, that will qualify for the incentives.
So most of the refining right now, I understand, is done in China for
today
these batteries.
Today.
So this is basically money that some other companies would use to build factories. Is that what that money is about, or is it just basically OEM is sort of gets its hand forced to say, okay, if you want to be able to pass along this $7,500 tax credit to your customer, you've got to make sure that this happens?
It's that's a complex question. It's a great question, because the U.S. government, that through programs like ATVM, Advanced Vehicle Manufacturing Programs, the EERE, which had $3.1 billion spread out last year, are building the battery value chain, which includes all of the processing capabilities to allow entities to have access to that $7,500. So it's a double hit, or a double benefit is probably the way. So that the U.S. government is helping to fund the manufacturing, production, construction, and launch, and will allow you to benefit from those incentives for the next 10 years, as far as the IRA is concerned, anyway.
Hey, look, we've got to take a quick commercial break for our good sponsor, Bridgestone. And then we got to come back and talk more about these these subsidies and what's going to be available to foreign automakers, because that's a big question mark. But first, a quick commercial break.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on what roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
All right, we're back talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. Bad name, as we established at the top of the show. But Devin, as you know, foreign automakers are very concerned about this because if you qualify as a consumer, you can get $7,500 in terms of a tax credit. But if you're not qualified, you're kind of screwed in that regard. And now the Treasury, look, the Biden administration, it's under enormous pressure from Europe, Japan, and South Korea saying, hey, come on, we're your allies. Don't you want us to help you with Ukraine and Taiwan and all this other stuff? Cut us some slack here. So I'm sure the Biden administration put the arm on the U.S. Treasury and said, figure out something here. And they came up with the idea that if you lease a car, that's actually a commercial transaction. And so you would be able to qualify for the $7,500. What do you think is going to end up? Because Senator Joe Manchin, West Virginia, came out and said, no way in hell. We wrote this thing that it's got to be made in the USA. So what are your thoughts, Devin? Where do you think this is all going to go?
Yeah, that's very tough. And it was interesting that it worked out that way. And I think to your point, certainly when you look at the strength and the amount of vehicles that Honda and Toyota sell over here, that is definitely a case. And the amount of production that they actually already have in the United States. Do you really want to punish them if you're deciding that this is going to be your powertrain technology choice in the future? I don't think that you do, especially with the reputation that a company like Toyota has for being green. So I think in terms of the leasing, it sounds like, I guess, as everyone calls it, a loophole that they were able to kind of work through, at least for 2023. I speculate that it may be able to get closed probably by the end of this year, but I would expect something else to be offered, again, because you don't want to go ahead and really alienate your allies. Now, in terms of, for maybe some of the other manufacturers, they may be able to kind of stay away from the tax credit because if they make enough of a profit on their vehicles, that it may be something they feel their consumers are going to purchase those vehicles already instead. And I'm sure, in a moment, we're going to touch on some of those other manufacturers that may be mostly hurt by it. But right now, there's at least certainly more of a loophole for those who can go ahead and at least try to get some traction in, at least for 2023, under this kind of leasing agreement that they have going on.
So you think the leasing agreement is sticking for now, at least?
I don't think it's probably going to be pulled off by, maybe March. It may be something that they may say, okay, you can have it up until the end of this year, because it'd be kind of rough to just run it for 3 or 4 months and then say, okay, now we're not going to do it. We're going to close this off. So they may still give them a little bit of a grace period until they come up with another solution.
Yeah, Mark, what do you think?
I think it's really difficult right now to mess around with the pricing and the deals that consumers are exposed to when we're in all the OEMs, particularly a GM and a Ford, trying to encourage, and I always should include Tesla, but really trying to encourage the adoption. If I'm thinking about buying an electric vehicle right now and deals are on and off the table, I'm going to wait, right? I'm not going to be jumping in as Devin mentioned. I don't think there's any advantage to the automakers anyway. Maybe the feds is a different issue, to be playing around with that. Not least of which is, if I'm buying a vehicle and a lot of these deals are in flux. What is my residual? What is my, is last year's Tesla worth more than my Tesla now? I mean, I'm not happy with that. If I'm a consumer, I'm not going to wait.
Mark, do you think that's a strategy, or this is just something that Elon Musk, being Elon Musk, just said, okay, I want to juice sales. I'm going to cut prices, and then you saw Ford follow,
Yep.
and And as you said earlier, this is sort of unprecedented in this industry. When does somebody cut costs when demand is so high? Isn't it the opposite?
It's a complex issue, right? Because you've got the the startups who are going, trying to go direct to customer. You've got, historically, you've got, the OEMs playing with dealer incentives, etc. You've got, you've got this federal money that's floating around that can play around with different pricing levels, and you've got a nervous consumer base that's really trying to think. I'm nervous about the range now. I'm nervous about buying one because of the pricing. I mean, come on. I need to understand with some certainty what's going on. So I don't think it's helpful. I mean, overall, I don't think it's helpful to the marketplace, to the OEMs to be pushing this certain this strategy. It's much the U.S. consumer is much more akin to a high price vehicle, a medium price vehicle, a low price vehicle, and unfortunately, right now they don't have a lot of those options to buy. Right, we've seen the $30,000 Equinox announced, last fall at the show. Whether there'll be many of those, I'm not sure. It's probably like a $59,000 Corvette, right? Probably not many of those knocking around. But maybe the 30, 37, 38, which is still, well below transaction prices now. That's what I'm looking for if I'm a consumer. I'm not looking for any games, to be honest with you.
Hey, Devin, sorry. Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I was going to ask Mike. I mean, when we're talking about this pricing situation, and when you talk to the guys at Ford, I mean, are they comfortable with having had to do that, or do you think that there's some reticence there?
I can't say for sure because they wouldn't tell me. But I can't believe they are too happy having to do that. I will tell you, in dealer world, which our publication really focuses on, and I'm chatting with a bunch of them, they're so confused and they want answers. They don't know what to tell their customers. And to Mark's point, that leads to more uncertainty, right? Because these buyers are looking to the dealers to provide some clarity and provide some information, some basic information to them about this, very expensive piece of equipment that they're trying to buy. Dealers don't know what to say right now. In terms of the incentives, a lot of them are just saying, hey, talk to your tax accountant. They will probably be able to help you more than we can. I talked with Ford's Dealer Council Chairman, Tim Hovick. He's been around quite some time. He's a dealer down in Arizona. And he gave me a great quote. In this industry, we love good zingers, right? And he said something like, you basically need an abacus and a Ouija board and a pair of dice to figure out whether or not you qualify. And that's hard from my perspective to tell customers. I just don't know. So they need some clarity here. But again, in terms of that price war, interesting that Ford's really the only one that jumped in on that, right? We haven't seen it expand any further. And again, I've mentioned this a number of times on the show already, but they don't have any profit margins on these vehicles. So the fact that they were the ones to jump in and raise their prices and change their prices, is quite interesting.
Yeah, and then,
Mike,
then Elon put money back on. I mean, Elon pushed it back on, and Ford didn't do that.
Exactly.
Did Elon sucker Ford into dropping its prices, and then he turns around and raises them?
Yeah, I think.
Good chess move.
I don't want to say no. In a way, yeah, I think it looks that way.
Yeah. Hey, Devin, you raised it before. I think there's at least a half a dozen automakers that are under a real threat of the IRA. My guess is, to your point, that Treasury will say, okay, we'll let this loophole of leases qualifying go on for maybe to the end of the year. But, Congress was pretty adamant. They want this to be a made in the USA kind of a program. So when I look at Subaru, Mitsubishi, Jaguar Land Rover, Mazda, Porsche, and Audi, looks to me like the IRA puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Porsche, it probably doesn't matter. Porsche is going to be able to sell Porsches. Their buyers don't. In fact, their buyers probably don't even qualify for the $7,500. But the rest of them, especially like a Subaru and a Mazda, yikes! What do you think they're going to do?
And this is why I started talking about customers when we include IRA, because it's still slightly two different things, but yet they're both still so interdependent on each other. And when we look at Mazda and we look at Subaru, especially for their buyers, it does really put them into a bind because, like you said, it's at a competitive disadvantage. The person, even if it, for all the things intended, let's consider all of the Porsches or Jaguar Land Rovers even qualifying if they're under that $80,000 SUV threshold or $50,000 for passenger cars. People still want those nameplates really no matter what. So it may not be as much fear from the competition, but Mazda and Subaru are competing against Honda, Toyota, GM, Ford, etc. And so now, from what we are anticipating, probably the one that's going to turn out, we'll say, the best and kind of really tweaking its plans, probably according to IRA, we assume it's going to end up being Mazda. Right now, just from what we're understanding in the market, Subaru doesn't really have an answer yet. And I think that's kind of tough for them because when you look at the number of models that they sell, certainly a limited number. And it's certainly how, I think all automakers are dealing with how do we transfer our DNA into this new electric vehicle space. Subaru has always been with that boxer engine, and they've always had just kind of some things about Subaru that made them unique, especially on an internal combustion engine. How do you translate that over to battery electric vehicles? Maybe that's something that they're working on, but now having to locally produce in the U.S. is going to be very, very difficult. And I think Mazda, we anticipate them beginning to localize some production and really put more emphasis on some of their hybrids. When I say localize, I mean in North America, for them to be able to qualify for some of the available tax credits for their consumers.
Yeah, Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think at least from the Ford perspective, they're expecting, most of what they have to be able to qualify at least for that 3750, right? They're trying to work out the whole mineral element of it to see if their guys can get the full 7,500. But it's going to be a concern moving forward here.
And Mark, what do you think? Are Mazda and Subaru going to have to hitch their wagon to Toyota? I mean, they're part of the big umbrella group there, as it were. Toyota has equity ownership in them, but how do you think this is going to play out for them? And I guess we could throw Mitsubishi in there too.
Yeah, I think Subaru's already hitching their wagon pretty strongly to Toyota with the BZ platform. If you saw their announcement, when was it, a couple of weeks ago, of the dual badged BZ Toyota. I think that's leveraging from their historic relationship. I mean, think all the way back to Subaru of Indiana. I think they were manufacturing Corollas back in the same plant. They were making all the way back there. So there's no change there. Mitsubishi is kind of interesting. Obviously in the with their longer term relationships and really with their volumes here, are they going to stay an ICE play? Maybe. I think that's possible. Mazda, I think Mazda are making some moves. I think Devin, you just mentioned that. Mazda, I think is they've already announced interest in their own manufacturing in the US, in battery manufacturing. So that's an interesting one to look at. I look at Hyundai Kia. I mean, Hyundai Kia right now, for example, I think some of their EV product is fantastic, and they have the manufacturing facility. They surely need expansion in the US in any regard. So I mean, I would look to them to think about that being an EV expansion in the US. There's no reason why it shouldn't be.
Well, sure. No, they've already announced they're putting in a $5 billion EV plant,
right,
and also putting in a battery plant. So, they're no fools. They know what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, they've been looking for expansion for a while now. So as you said, that announcement is absolutely in line with where we want. Then Honda. I mean, I think Honda, the retooling of their facilities in Ohio is really significant. I think their announcements, to date have been right on point. Nissan, remains Nissan, but so I think there's, the one I'm interested in is seeing whether what VW is going to do for growth in the US, VW Group. I think that is going to be is something really interesting to look for.
But it's sort of interesting if you think about it, okay, to the point of VW. I mean, so we've seen the ID4 has not, set the world on fire, right?
Right.
Yet, they are good corporate citizens. They're building them in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I mean, they're doing all the right things. And we talk about these vehicles and the IRA money and things like that as though, tax credits sell cars.
Yeah.
And, and if you think about it, I mean, Tesla did pretty good for quite a while without anybody giving them any money to do that. And, and I think, Devin, goes back to your thing about, customer demand and what we're going to see. And so according to Kelley Blue Book's most recent numbers, the average price of an electric vehicle in the United States last month was $58,725. Okay. Is the IRA going to change that? Or is this just wishful thinking?
Well, I would say that I think IRA has more of an impact when we start having much more of a mature market. Right now, people are buying what they really want to buy. And obviously, with most of your electric vehicles being sold are Teslas, that's a perfect example of that. But once we start getting to that point where, certainly if we get to the Biden administration having the desire of 50% of the vehicles sold being battery electric by 2030, when OEMs have to have pretty much a complete model lineup of being battery electric, then I think that's when you'll have so many customers that, or at least they hope, would be wanting a battery electric vehicle where they then will start doing price comparisons and saying, you know what, $7,500 or $3,750, that's enough to make me maybe want to buy that vehicle over another. Because again, right now, no one's going to be making their distinction based on the transmission, whether it's a manual, automatic, or DCT, or whether it's, a V8 or V6. It's going to perhaps come down to price and other amenities. And I think that's when IRA really have its teeth in there to benefit some of the automakers.
Mark, you had mentioned Nissan. I got a question for you, and probably for Devin too. I mean, when I look at all the major automakers, they've all announced plans for battery plants, except for Volkswagen and Nissan. Volkswagen says it's committed, I guess, to building one in Ontario in Canada, but they're still searching for a site, they say. And Nissan, almost a year ago, said it was very shortly going to announce where its battery plant's going. And here we are nearly a year later and nothing's happened. What do you think's holding them up? Or do you have any ideas on that?
I suspect, Nissan's getting a little bit holed up with just overall profitability and the ability to invest in those, those facilities. What you're talking about, $2.5 billion for a Ultium size or a Blue Oval size kind of plant. That's not insignificant. What I find about Nissan is their marketing versus the reality feels like the biggest stretch to me is where you have Nissan thinking about being an organization that's built cars that have gone $5 billion on 5 billion miles on electric propulsion, but then you don't see that commitment going forward. I mean, interestingly, the reorganization at Toyota and the building of their new management team might make Toyota more aggressive than Nissan in the future in the EV world. Which who would have thought of that even 6 months ago, right? But I think that's maybe where we're seeing that change there. But I suspect it's with everything at Nissan, a lot of it, goes back to overall profitability, financials, and the ability to make those investments.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Devin.
No, I certainly agree with that. I think Nissan is a perfect example of even still determining on what propulsion system, they had the e-power system that they called it, primarily in Japan, that they were looking at here for the US, that seems to be on again, off again. So I still think they're trying to find its way. And certainly even for VW and perhaps for, all the automakers that started getting into the battery business about a decade ago, and it didn't work out too well. Maybe they're being a little bit more risk averse for a couple of them right now, as they work out some of the other issues in terms of working out which models that they want to come out with, where that production is going to take place at. And maybe they already have some battery prices locked in that they don't have to worry about it too much in the short term.
Well, John, you probably remember a few years ago when we were down in Smyrna, Tennessee, when Nissan showed us their battery plant. I mean, and they were, Ford didn't have one, General Motors didn't have one. There's Nissan saying, hey, we're making batteries for Leafs.
Oh yeah, and they put a plant in Japan. They put one in Sunderland in the UK, in England as well. I mean, Carlos Ghosn at the time, remember he said, we have a competitive advantage that nobody else can match. And And now that plant in Smyrna belongs to Envision AESE. They got rid of, and this is what's so crazy. They sold that plant off, and now they're looking for a location to build a battery plant. I mean, it's just nuts. But Mark, I want to go back to a point that you made that I agree with you about Toyota. I think you're going to see a dramatic change in their messaging sometime after April 1st. Because April 1st is when Akio Toyoda gets kicked upstairs, becomes the chairman of the company. And, I don't know if it was a boardroom coup or what was going on, but that management change came out of nowhere. And I know it caught people at Toyota by surprise. There was no indication of that happening. And my reading of the tea leaves is that the board said, hey, the environmentalists are kicking our teeth in here because we're dragging our heels here on EVs. And so I think once they make the change and maybe, a month or two goes by and everybody forgets that Akio was promoted, boom, they're going to come out and show a much more aggressive stance with EVs.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now, I was in Japan last year. We did a tour of a lot of different suppliers, OEMs, etc., and no indication that this was on the cards by any stretch of the imagination. You've had consistent message coming out of Toyota. What are they, about 12 million units globally, somewhere in that regard?
They're down to 10 now, and
10,
they might even drop under 10.
Right. So they were saying, somewhere in the 15-20% will be, EVs, but they never really said what EVs were. I mean, fuel cell was still, a major component of that strategy. I think seems to be about to be blown up. Yet to see who Sato brings on from the management team perspective, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of non-Japanese executives or talent coming into that management team, at least at the technical levels, to bring that thought.
And who knows, maybe even a woman or two, because they got zero right now.
It's not unusual for Japan, but I certainly agree with that.
Okay, so Morning Consult just did a survey, and it found they asked people if they'd be very interested in buying an EV within the next 5 years. Now, this doesn't bring us to Joe Biden's 2030 when there's going to be 50% of EVs out there, but okay, 2028. Of all the people, 19% said they'd be interested in buying an EV within 5 years. And it just seems to me that again, it's a tremendous amount of money, billions and billions of dollars that we're investing in this. And by the way, John, Akio wasn't kicked upstairs; he walked upstairs. So getting back to like the Toyota strategy, or Mike, even with Ford Blue, these guys are still making engines; they're still making money. I just am a little confused about this. And then John, as you guys reported on Autoline Daily today, the Europeans said, 2035, we're done with ICEs. Yep. And then Italy said, nah, we're not so sure about that. Yep. Okay. Right. So we're acting as though this is fait accompli. And somebody explain to me why I'm wrong.
Dead silence tells you everything.
Well, you're not wrong. But, interesting announcement from GM a month or so ago now about almost $1 billion investment in 4 facilities. The V8 engine. But when you break that announcement apart, actually, there was money there for thermal management and lines, etc., for EVs. So it's not all. It was a
little
I think
bit of money for that.
250 million. I think it was perhaps more than we think. But conrods, crankshafts, engine, block machining. I mean, if that's not something right out of the 90s announcements, I don't know what is. But a GM would say they have no plan B, right? There is no plan B. This is it. But their plan B is really bringing, their strong engine line, keeping that going, improving the manufacturing efficiency of it, Is this the first, admission of that? I'm not sure, but it's certainly it's an interesting announcement.
I'll say from the Ford perspective and splitting the company, when they announced it was, a year ago in March, coming up on the 1-year anniversary. And when they announced that the conventional wisdom was, well, this is just the first step. And then, in a decade or so, we'll see them just sort of get rid of Ford Blue and Model E. That'll be the company, right? That'll be all that's left. But, I would wonder, hey, what if things go south with EVs? What if they don't really catch off? Maybe Ford Blue is the company that ends up surviving here. And I think, from the company's perspective, they want to specialize right in each area and give each business unit the appropriate bandwidth to grow. But you see things like the new Mustang, right? And that's probably going to go through at least the end of the decade. All gas. The new Super Duty coming online right now. They've talked about, again, it gets back to use case, right? There's customers that really don't need an EV or the work they do. EVs can't help with that right now. So they need a gas powered, Super Duty, and that's going to stay that way for a long time. And notably, Ford has not said it's going all electric, at least in the US. They've made that announcement in Europe. But yeah, I think we may be past the point of no return to a certain extent in terms of all the money here, but they do have the gas growth aspirations on the gas side as well. They're not trying to get rid of that anytime soon.
And I'll just throw in that we still also are going to have corporate average, or we'll say CAFE, corporate average fuel economy standards that are still expected to get more and more stringent, each round that comes out. So in the meantime, it's not like they're going to meet those, and at least that's certainly the part with the federal government. It's really powertrain agnostic to how a manufacturer can do that, as opposed to a zero emission mandate. So at least as that goes, they can at least have the ICE become more efficient in the meantime, if case that adoption rate is slow. And seeing that right now, we still know the popularity behind pickup trucks, large SUVs. You need to make those ICEs much more fuel efficient, especially if they end up taking you out until the 2030s. So it definitely makes sense to still have that investment going on. You may just have to be a little bit quiet when you do it, because you don't really want to publicize that.
Yeah, that may be the whole thing right there.
That's right. That's right. Hey, look, we're at the top of the hour. I know we could go another hour on this. This has been a terrific conversation, but I think it's a good time to wrap it up. So Devin Lindsay from S&P Global Mobility, Mark Barrett from Plante Moran, Mike Martinez from Automotive News. Thanks, you guys. This is really good. You guys have shared a lot of valuable information with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. And Gary, I'll see you next week. Thanks.
Autoline After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the Autoline channel.